Is the Writers Are People Too podcast, where I just can't get authors to shut up. Tonight, we have with us author Jason Kyle. Before we get into your book, tell me a little bit about your background and, how you took an interest in writing.
Yeah, sure. I've always been interested in writing since I was a kid. I thought I was going to get into comics because I'm also an artist. Um, and then as far as my background, I joined the Army right out of high school while I was in high school, actually. I've always been a history nerd as well as a artist. And like I said, doing a little bit of writing. While I was in the Army, I wrote a fantasy book, didn't get anywhere with it. Um, And then, like literally a year ago, as I'm phasing out, getting ready to retire from the Army, I decided to write an Arthurian novel. And that's the one that just launched February 1st on Amazon with Duke Cannon Publishing.
Awesome. Yeah, well, we'll definitely talk about that in a second here. And, I hope this is not a sore subject, and I'd love to chat about it for a second, but you mentioned that there was a fantasy novel that you didn't do anything with. Is that because you think you've matured past that? Is that because you think it's not good enough and you want to revisit it someday? Like, what's your thought process behind that?
It's something I want to revisit someday. I'm learning a lot. This is my work with John Holmes and Cannon Publishing. Um, is my first real chance that I've ever had to work with truly professional editors and publishers. So
Mhm.
I've learned the hard way with my story Beyond the Wall that I wasn't nearly as good of a writer as I had kind of thought in my own head. Just 'cause I always got good grades in college. Whenever I showed my fantasy story around to friends, they all liked it. And then when I showed it to Canon Publishing, they're like, yeah, it's good, but it needs a lot of work. And then
Mhm.
after spending almost as much time editing the novel as I spent writing the novel and seeing the difference between the two manuscripts, I'm like, yeah, it did need a lot of work. So I'm going to spend some time on my Arthurian novels, and then eventually I'll go back to my fantasy fiction novel and see what I
Mhm.
can do with it.
Yeah, I think we all have that moment of we're not as good as we think we are, and it's going to take a lot of practice to get there. Because I read my favorite books, and I'm like, oh man, these authors are so great. They must have just, woke up one day and wrote it, and I'm going to do the same thing. But it's not like that. It does take a lot of work. So, you're not alone in that. And I also have a manuscript that is a sci-fi fantasy mashup that I wrote, between 2014 to 17.
Okay.
And that's also sitting on the shelf because I realize it needs a lot more work. Hopefully we'll get around to that again here pretty soon. Um, but yeah, your novel Beyond the Wall, like you said, came out February 1st. It's tagged as a novel of post-Roman Britain. Um, how much is there any sort of role that you bring the Roman Empire into, the vestige of the Roman Empire, or is this kind of just all post-Roman?
I tried to make as many nods to Rome as I could. I love the Roman Empire. One of my biggest inspirations for writing Beyond the Wall in the first place. I've liked Arthur as far back as 2004, the King Arthur movie. And I liked Arthur a little bit before that. I started developing a serious interest with the 2004 movie with Clive Owen. And then I think most guys, it seems from what I saw on the internet, most guys think about the Roman Empire from time to time. Um,
I think it was like a couple times a day on average.
yeah,
I'm not that high, maybe
a
like
platoon
once a week
sergeant.
for me, but
I was at a training exercise at National Training Center. A platoon sergeant introduced me to Simon Scarrow. I read all his books, looked for something else. I found James Mace, who writes another fantastic Roman series about the Arthurian family, starting from like 9 AD, and he's taken it all the way to the late 200s, I think it is. Um, and as I'm reading these books about Rome, and I'm like, I like King Arthur, but short of that one movie that I saw 20 years ago now, um, I've never seen Arthur taken seriously by anybody. And even that 2004 account, the more I've learned about history over the last 20 years, the more I realize how badly that movie did. And I'm like, what if somebody treated King Arthur with the same seriousness that people like Simon Scarrow and James Mace treats the Roman Empire? And I couldn't find anybody doing that. Even people who normally write very grounded historical fiction. Bernard Cornwell, I think his name. I always get his last name messed up. The guy who wrote the Last Kingdom series. He also wrote the Napoleonic War Sharp series. Really good science, really good historical fiction. And then as soon as he starts into the Arthurian world, he brings out the magic and the mysticism and stuff like that. And it's like, why?
So I would assume then, judging by your tone, that you don't have any sort of nods to a magical Merlin or Morgan Le Fay or runes or anything like that. This is all strictly historical fiction, or is it not?
yes, I bring those characters into it. My character, instead of Merlin, it's Myrthin, which was the actual Welsh name. It's hard to spell. It's hard looking at Welsh names without, or it's hard pronouncing Welsh names without being able to even look at them. Myrdyn or something like that.
Okay.
It looks like it should be Mitterdin. But the double D in Welsh is the, so it's Myrthin. Geoffrey of Monmouth, when he wrote about King Arthur in his 12th century manuscript, from what I've read, I can't say for 100% that this is true, but what I've read is that when Geoffrey was transcribing his account for the rich Norman overlords, he took the name. He knew of the name Myrthin, but in spelling it looked too close to the French word Mirda, if you know what that means. And he's like, nope. And he changed the middle part of it so that it read Merlin instead. That's
Okay. What does the French word name mean? I don't know that.
It means crap.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I do have a Myrthin character. He is a wise advisor, bit of a know-it-all. I kind of actually modeled him more after Benjamin Franklin than anything else.
Okay.
Somebody who's smart enough can be thought of as a wizard. So I tried to keep that kind of persona. But yeah, my story, there's no magic, there's no mysticism. Actually took a minute for my publisher to wrap his head around it. He wanted a magical Arthurian world, and I'm like, no, I want somebody to be able to go from reading Simon Scarrow or James Mace into my story and feel like they're reading events in the same real world.
Yeah, and I think there's certainly a value to that. And I'm curious. So going back to, you said your first interactions with Arthur. Mine, I think it would have to be the Sword and the Stone. Disney's The Sword and the Stone cartoon version way back. It probably came out in the 80s, maybe 90s. I don't know exactly.
Earlier than that, man.
Earlier than that? Oh man.
Yeah.
All right. I guess we're dating ourselves.
70s.
70s? Jeez. All right. Well,
Right.
I watched it back in the 90s.
Okay. Yeah, same.
So, and there's obviously like lots of mysticism and magic in that, like pulling the sword out of the stone, and then Merlin's magic. How did you not include any nods to that at all? Like, people think he's a magician, but he's not really, or you're just like straight edge. This is what I found in some manuscript or something like that.
So for Beyond the Wall, he only has a cameo. Myrthin he has a quick cameo scene just to let readers know early on that he is part of my world. Morgana gets a name drop. She is going to be part of it. Both of these characters are going to be huge characters in my book 2 that I'm actually writing. I was writing right up to the point when I got your email saying it was almost showtime. But yeah, there's a fine line between, so like Morgana, for example, she might call herself a wizard at times in my book as an intimidation tactic, because we are talking about a time period when people absolutely do believe in magic. They do believe in witchcraft. I'm leaning hard into the idea that people believe in werewolves, because I'm pulling for book 2. I'm pulling a lot of reference material out of an old Welsh story called, I'm probably mispronouncing this, but the Pagur. And it tells about a guy called Garluweed, and he's the leader of a pack of Sinbin, which, from what I've been able to research online, is basically Welsh werewolves. So obviously in my story they're not going to be actually werewolves, but
Yeah.
reality isn't as important as what people think is reality, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting that you're taking that dynamic because I actually took the opposite dynamic in my most recent fantasy I put out, which was
That's
in the
fun too.
beginning, it's a kingdom that believes nothing about magic. They're all about science. They don't think magic exists. It's fake to them. They don't believe in religion or anything. And all of a sudden, this mage shows up. So it's a very different dynamic of not believing and it does exist versus they do believe and it doesn't exist, and the kind of tricks you can play on the characters as well as your audience, perhaps.
Oh, I
Um,
mean, your approach can be fun too. I mean, John Holmes kind of does that to an extent with his Fey Wars, which is kind of Canon Publishing's
mhm.
flagship.
Yeah. Yeah, I see him posting about that all the time. I'll have to have him back on to chat about that
Oh, Fey
again.
Wars is so awesome.
Awesome. So why did you take an interest in Brittania then? And I do think about the Roman Empire occasionally, and I think it's fascinating how all like you can look at Gladiator, for example, which I think takes place in like Germania, and then
It
this takes place.
starts in Germania,
Okay,
and
yeah,
then it
I'm
moved.
not familiar with all of it, but
Yeah,
okay,
the
and
gorgeous opening battle scene is supposed to be um, Emperor Aurelius's last battle in Germania, and then the action all shifts to North Africa and then to Rome itself.
mhm.
But
Yeah,
yeah, as
and it's
far as
just like Rome
my
was such a widespread. I mean, they're a huge empire. Like, I mean, if you think
oh yeah,
about, like, for example, the Bible takes place in the Middle East. That's
mm-hmm.
the Roman Empire, and then
Yep,
you have the Britannia things going on, thousands of miles away up to
mm-hmm.
the northwest, and then like what made you specifically choose this section? Is it just an interest in Arthur?
Partially that, partially it's just an interesting story. Post Roman Britain was a post apocalyptic Wild West, but with a very early medieval setting. So that's part of it. The other part is, I mean, my own family. Kyle. Kyle is a Gaelic name. There's actually a little spot in Scotland called Kyle. I actually thought for the longest time, I assumed my family was just Scottish and that was the end of it. And then I did a DNA test, found out like 90% of my DNA comes from like northern Germany area. So if anything, my family was probably more the invading Saxons than anything. But either way, it's still we all
Mhm.
end up in Britain. So it's a fascinating story.
Would you characterize this as like a historical fiction or a military historical fiction, or what's the exact subgenre?
Yes, um, it is historical military fiction. I think that would be the easiest way to categorize it. But you gotta also add that early medieval slash post Roman. I think post Roman would be more. When I think of early medieval, I think of Alfred the Great onward, um, roughly that period. So this is I don't even think early medieval is accurate, but I think Dark Age or post Roman military historical fiction. If you
Mhm.
want to put all those taglines in there.
So do you get pretty in depth about any battles that take place with like their formations and what's going on? Is it like a sword and sorcery hack and slash or more tactical?
Well, not sword and sorcery, closer to sword and
Oh, yeah.
sandals. But yes, so I spent my first 5 years in the Army, some of that in the reserves, as a combat engineer. And then I switched to a cavalry scout, deployed twice to Iraq as a cavalry scout. Um, did a lot of training as oppositional forces at National Training Center as a cavalry scout. So I like the cavalry mindset. So yes, my story incorporates a couple of scouting type missions that my character Parador inadvertently engages in, as in he gets separated from his unit and just kind of has to do some evading and escaping and surviving on his own. And in the process, he's able to gather some intelligence to give to Arthur when he reunites with him. Um, and then the story itself, the centerpiece of it is so Nennius, a Welsh, I think he was Welsh, writer in the mid 800s, he's one of the first writers that any historian is willing to give any kind of historical credibility to in the Arthurian mythos. And even he doesn't write a whole lot about Arthur. It's barely more than a footnote. Mostly his thing is centered on Vortigern. But anyway, he lists 12 battles that Arthur is supposed to have fought. And I'm treating Nennius as if he were a credible source. I'm looking at all, that's the main thing that I'm doing with my stories. I'm going through it, looking at all these sources, these early medieval sources that historians all go, oh, these guys don't know what they're talking about, even though they lived in that same time period. They're all wrong. We know what's actually accurate, you know. So I'm looking at these sources going, okay, maybe they're wrong. Let me just see what I can do if I were to take these sources at face value without any other evidence saying that they're flat out wrong and be able to prove it. What would happen if I wrote an Arthurian source or a story using these sources that everybody else is ignoring? So Nennius says Arthur fought 12 battles. Cool. I tried to pinpoint as best I could, like every other Arthurian nerd out there. I tried to pick out where these 12 battles may have been fought and then fit my own narrative, looking at all kinds of data. And so Parador's story. So I wrote out, I've got like 3 different Excel spreadsheets because that's the kind of nerd I am, with a full in-depth Arthurian breakdown going all the way back to the early or mid 300s all the way out to the middle 500s. That's how far I've spread my timeline out. Who lived when, where, what historical events took place in that time frame, so I know where everybody is supposed to be at any given time. So I started my timeline with stuff that history all agrees happened, and then I started plugging in stuff from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Nennius, Geoffrey of Monmouth, and just figuring out, okay, where can this stuff fit within known history? So Nennius says he fought 12 battles. I figured out the best time and place that makes sense within my story. And then rather than start with the core Arthurian story of Arthur, I have a timeline worked out, a set of stories that I want to write, starting with Arthur's grandfather, who Geoffrey of Monmouth says was a guy named Constantine. Constantine then had the sons Ambrosius, Aurelianus, and Uther. And then, of course, Uther has Arthur. But I was a little intimidated with starting with that core timeline with Constantine, so I decided, let me write a smaller, less ambitious trilogy around one of Arthur's younger soldiers, so we can still get Arthur, but from the eyes of one of his men. And it'll be a little bit more family friendly. When I first started writing, I hadn't envisioned it being quite as ambitious as it ended up being. I thought it was going to be more of a slimmer YA novel, and just kind of evolved.
It always does.
Yeah. So my first foray into this whole Arthurian world is beginning with Parador, he started out in my first draft. He was a 14-year-old kid, a couple years older than my son is now. By the time it got submitted for final editing, I had aged him up to 16, and he was taking more direct part in some of the battles. But either way, Parador's trilogy is going to cover from the years 506 to 509, and it is going to cover specifically like the last 4 of Arthur's 12 battles.
Okay. So you've brought up Parador a couple times. Let's go back to Arthur for 1 second there. Obviously, he's like this legendary character, but what role does he play in the story? Is he also a main character? Is he a mentor? Is he just kind of someone who's over there and he gives, Parador some orders, and then the story's about Parador? Like, how do they interact?
So Nennius describes Arthur not as a king, but as a dux bellorum, which is loosely comparable to a task force commander in today's military concepts. It's not even a permanent rank, it's more of a temporary position. So given that this is all happening in the year around 500, only 25 years after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. I decided if Arthur's not a king, to be able to have fight battles all up and down Britain, because before I even started writing, I mapped out where all I thought his battles occurred, who they were. I had to establish for myself where they were fought, who he was fighting, based on those locations, because I know where everybody's start zones are. If you're thinking of it from like a total war kind of image in my head, right? Like, okay, I know the Saxons are here. I know the Scottish, the Picts are up here. I know the Irish are over here. So if these battles are fought in this general area, who is he probably fighting? So I figured, okay, Arthur's a military commander, not a king. His command, let's assume he's an elite commander. For him to be able to travel the way he is, he's probably a cavalry commander, especially because during this time period, cavalry were a very elite force, and they were throughout the whole medieval period. Plus, I'm also trying to be a little bit as faithful as I can to that Arthurian mythos. I don't want to change up so much that people read the book thinking they're going to get Arthur, and then it was just like, oh, there's nothing recognizable here. So I did try to kind of revisit one of your earlier questions. I did try to make it as similar as I could to the Arthurian legend within a historical context. So I made Arthur a military commander in a late Roman style unit, which would be a numerus equitum, which is basically just a military unit of cavalry, is I think what it translates to in Latin. And then I had to research the structure of what those late Roman units looked like in the early 400s, in that final century of the Roman Empire. So I established, okay, a numerus equitum, you still have, they're broken down into terma, which are basically platoons of about 30 men. They're still led by decurions, just like they were in the High Roman Empire. And they're led by a tribune. So that's what I ended up making Arthur, was a tribune. So as far as his relationship with Peridor, who by the way is just the early Welsh version of Percival, Peridor is a 16-year-old wide-eyed, innocent new recruit. I actually modeled him very much after what Chrétien de Troyes and Thomas Mallory's Percival was depicted as. So Peridor joins them. He's well trained because he's a nobleman's son, so he's trained to fight. But he grew up in my setting. He grew up on a more relatively safe villa in modern day Anglesey, so he has no idea of the wide world other than what he's read or heard from merchant ships. His older brother is killed fighting the Saxons, also in Arthur's command. He wants revenge. He wants adventure. So he joins the military to get revenge and get rich, which is the reason a lot of kids join the military throughout any time in history.
Yeah.
So he joins Arthur's unit. He gets trained up because he finds out really quickly, as good as his training back in his small village was, it's not up to par for being in Arthur's elite unit. So he gets trained up just in time to go north into modern day Scotland to fight against Pict barbarians. And that's both of his battles in that story are going to be against the Picts. And they fight him in the woods in Scotland, which is, if you pulled up a list of Nennius's 12 battles, that would be the Battle of Celadon Coit. And then they go south and they fight the Picts again at a quickly refurbished fort along the Antonine Wall. And that's the wall that the title itself references.
Okay. I love the amount of research that you put into this, including the terminology that you're using. I feel like, now that I'm thinking about it, I think when I first found you was on the Facebook group and you were asking, would you prefer if I used the terminology or kind of like dumbed it down for the reader? And I was fully on board with you, like using all the exact correct terminology. Give me a glossary at the end, I'll be happy. So I'm glad you stuck with that.
Yeah, that was a debate me and my publisher had. He wanted me to use, I'm not sure what terms he wanted, but he didn't want terma. He didn't like Decurion. There was a couple other terms he didn't like, and I was just like, no, I want to use the actual terms. If you read a book on ancient Rome, you're gonna want to see centurions, not captains. You're gonna want to see cohorts and legions, not brigades and divisions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So wherever possible, I tried to use the actual terminology. And
And
then
where did you go? How'd you go about doing all your research? Is this just a lot of Googling, or did you read books?
So I do have. I actually have a hard copy of Nennius's History of the Britons. I have a copy of Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. I have a copy of Gildas and Bede, who wrote in the fifth and seventh century. And I actually just today ordered to help with my timeline because I was tired of seeing conflicting Google references to it. I just ordered a copy of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was a historical record ordered by Alfred the Great when he became king of the Saxons, really one of the first kings of Britain in the late 800s, I want to say. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle goes all the way back from the mid 400s all the way up to the medieval period. So I
Awesome.
actually just ordered a physical. So I do have physical copies of a lot of these original sources. But then, yeah, for some things like the kind of like Roman units, I do a lot of Googling, and I'm also plugged into a lot of Facebook groups on reenactment groups, and I pester them with questions.
Awesome. Cool. Did you want to read an excerpt? If you're not prepared, I won't put you on the spot. If you need a couple of minutes, take your time. I can always just edit this out.
Give me a couple minutes on that. Yeah, I think I can cover this quick scene in a couple of minutes.
Cool.
All right, I'm ready when you are.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. I sighed. This was finally it, I figured. I'd survived the patrol that attacked Gilbert, and days earlier, I'd survived the the chase that had lasted often on all this afternoon and evening. I saw no way out this time. I glanced back toward the lights of Din Iden for what I figured would be the final time, puzzled that they seemed to be bobbing up and down a bit. No matter. I was surprised to realize that it was Gemma's face that kept flashing before me as I gripped my sword in anticipation of the fight and its inevitable outcome. I was determined to die with honor at least, so I brought my sword up. Last hope, I screamed, the red dragon's battle cry at the top of my lungs, and kicked Karis into a gallop. Last hope, I thought I heard faintly in the distance. Then the fastest of the Picts greeted my charge. He stabbed at me with his spear. I blocked it with my shield, but the force of it sent me toppling backwards from Carrie's back. I hit the ground hard, and my sword and shield went flying. I rolled away immediately, and a thrown spear buried itself into the ground where I had just been. Beside me, Carrie's was a flurry of hooves flying in every direction, neighing loudly all the while and causing the Picts' horses to shy away. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the spear the Pict had tried to skewer me with. An armored warrior slashed at me with a sword, but I dodged out of the way and stabbed at him with the spear, knocking him off his mount. I spun around, prepared for another attack, but I was too slow. Another Pict bashed me in the head with his shield as he rode past me from behind me. I went down again, seeing bursts of light. I shook my head, fighting through the pain, and jumped up a moment later, pulling my dagger out as I did so. An armored warrior charged, hacking at me with an axe. I weaved to one side, but the axe still glanced off my chest, spinning me around from the momentum. Another Pict cocked his arm back, making to throw his spear at me. I braced myself, ready to spring to one side, when the tip of a javelin burst out of his chest from behind. The barbarian gasped in shock, looked down at the spear he'd been about to throw, tumbled out of his hand, and he fell to the ground. Then I heard a horn blast. The Picts heard it too, and we all realized that it was no Pict horn. I knew the sound, and I began to laugh in malicious glee. Last hope, I screamed again. The sound of dozens of voices streamed towards us, bellowed in response. Last hope, they roared, and again I heard the distinctive blast of our lituus. I think I'm pronouncing that right. The Picts and I turned to look eastward and saw a rank of horsemen, many carrying torches, galloping toward us. Metal gleamed from polished helms and the tips of javelins as they came on. At their head flew the brass-headed Draco standard. I snatched Carrie's reins and sprinted away from the picks, anticipating the coming storm, and the red dragons did not disappoint. A hail of javelins rained down on them, and in an instant, nearly every one of the group that had dogged me for the past hours were cut down like wheat before a scythe. The few remaining picks attempted to flee, but the red dragons cut them down as they swept past. I whooped and laughed in relief as the horsemen, at least 2 terma by my estimates, slowed to a halt and circled around toward me. The first face I recognized in the torchlight was my own Decurion, Owain. Beside him was Arthur himself. Further back, Gilbert grinned and waved. They looked down at me, smiling. I brought my right hand up in salute. Arthur nodded down at me. Out for an evening ride, Parador? Owain asked. And that's the scene.
Awesome. Thank you for
that.
that.
I got a career in voice narrating.
Yeah. Hey, reading your own book is something. I've wanted to read my own book. Some authors love to do that. Talk to John. Maybe he'll have you do that. I don't know.
No. And now I also realize I see little bits here and there, even as I'm reading, like, oh, I should have written that differently. But it's too late now. It's published.
You can't get stuck on wanting to fix every small thing. I've heard quotes that even famous authors are like, I read it and I wanted to fix something, and it's like you just got to be done with it at a certain point and just say, okay, this is it. This is as good as I can get it for this moment.
Yeah.
And, I've read things that I've written a decade ago, which obviously I want to change, but that was the best I could do in that moment, and I didn't want to wait a decade to get it out. So just get it out and improve on your next one. Yep. That thing that they were yelling, "Last Hope," is that what it was?
Yes. So that's the. That's so every Roman legions all used to have mottos, and I mean army units today, a lot of them still have mottos. So I want to give these guys a motto. Well, the background that I have for the Red Dragons, which is the unit that I'm calling them, as a nod to the Draco standards that the late Romans used to carry, and then most likely that's the symbol that became the Welsh flag that's still in use today, a red dragon on a white and green field. So I knew as soon as I started writing this from a historical perspective, I'm like, all right, I want to name them the Welsh Dragons. And then I started reading and I was like, oh, Welsh wasn't actually a thing at this point in time. Okay, so I'll just name them the Red Dragons. So within my timeline, and I've made a couple references, I explained a little bit of their back history in Beyond the Wall. But basically, this unit was formed up by Ambrosius, Aurelianus, and Uther, fighting for the Roman Empire in like the 460s, still fighting for Rome. So they did originally form up as just a cavalry unit in the Roman Empire. And then it's a case of the unit outlasted the empire they were formed to fight for. But because they formed up to fight in those last few battles for Rome, they acquired the battle cry or the motto of Last Hope.
Okay, that's cool. So why did you choose to write it in first person? Is this because you've been in combat situations before and you're like, I can see myself writing this through the character's eyes, or what was that about?
Actually, no. I did it because, like I said, I was originally picturing the story of Parador being for slightly younger readers especially when I first started writing it. And it was my belief that writing it first person would help make it more relatable to readers, especially younger readers. And even though, I mean, like you just read it, it's like you just heard me read it badly. It's kind of graphic, but not as graphic as, I think I kept my story about PG-13. So even though I aged up everything a little bit, I think, and I've had a couple parents confirm it with me, that they at least agree that while my story is entertaining for adults, it's still suitable for them to then hand to their older kids. So yeah, that one I just wanted, I wanted to do first person to help it make it more relatable to the readers. As far as my combat experience goes, that actually didn't help me as much as you might think. Like, this is another conversation I have with my publisher. It's kind of funny because I have been shot at. I have been mortared. And in reflection, so I've also been to the Army's air assault school, where we rappel off towers and then eventually we rappel out of a helicopter. We drill and drill for combat. So when I was in combat, only two things were going through my head. Don't be that cowardly private from Saving Private Ryan, and do what you were trained to do. And I just focused on that. Everything else was the RPGs and whatever. It was just background to me. I focused on my sector of fire, and I just had the idea of, hey, if you see a legitimate target, light them up. Everything else doesn't matter. Um, I was so when I'm writing scenes where Parador is scared, and my publisher, that was another thing he was beating me up about, is this kid needs to have more emotion, more emotion. To write him scared, I actually had to think back to air assault school. That was one of my scariest moments in my life. I am more scared of heights than I am of getting into a firefight.
Cool.
Like
Well,
way
hey,
more.
thanks for reading that. Thanks for way more.
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks for reading that. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Any final comments before I let you go?
Yeah. Please buy my book. It's look at the reviews speak for themselves. It's pretty accurate, I think, historically wise. It's pretty faithful to Arthurian lore. So if you're wanting a good, entertaining story about Arthur, and Arthur that you recognize from the legends, you're basically getting that, and it's a good, mostly family-friendly story as well to boot. And there's going to be a lot
Awesome.
more books to come.
Love it. Yeah. So everybody keep an eye out for Jason Kyle. The book is again titled, is it Beyond the Wall?
Yes, Beyond the Wall.
Perfect. All right. And we'll see you next time, everybody. We had Jason Kyle.
Thanks.